I wonder whether you remember those days when your friend invites you to have dinner and you have some doubts about it because you wondered whether they're going to serve you overcooked meatloaf with brown sauce, which is just not very appetizing. But what is worse is that after dinner, you can expect 3 hours of colored slideshow of family outing, and there you are stuck and struggling to keep awake. Well, it's clear that today I'm not giving a colored slideshow, but what I'm presenting is something similar. I think I would call it verbal slides, oral slides. In other words, short stories. And these stories are meant to illustrate the main theme of my talk today, which is the lessons I've learned in a long life. And you would wonder, here's this guy, 85 years old, who has had a professional career of at least 50 years. And he's going to talk about the lessons he has learned. That promises to be almost as long-winded and as boring as a long colors slideshow. But my short stories, my verbal slides, or vignettes as I call them, have one overarching theme, which is goodness, what one means by being good. You know, it seems strange that I've earned a good living as a teacher of geography. And yet, when I consider what I've really learned is not geography, not climate change and environmental problems that you hear so much about. It's really something that I feel we all wrestled with at some time in our life, namely what it means to be good. So this is what I would like to talk about in the next 40 minutes or so. I divide my life, as we all do, into 3 parts: childhood, adulthood, and old age. Let me start with my childhood. It's a very important stage in my life, as it is in all our lives. What we learn, what we're taught, what we have experienced as a child has a lasting influence, even though we may not be aware of it. The 3 years of my childhood that has had the most influence were between the ages of 7 and 10. And those were the years were 1938 and 1941. Those were the years when China was struggling to survive. Nearly the whole country was occupied by the Imperial Japanese Army. And what was left was a natural fortress, a basin surrounded by mountains. And at the center of this basin was Chongqing, the wartime capital. So this is where my family and I lived, in Chongqing between 1938 and 41. My father had a good job in the foreign ministry, and he had a good salary, but only on paper, because the check rarely arrived. So for months, he had no income at all, and he had to feed his children, 4 of us. So we were pretty much starving. So instead of having the regular 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we had 2, reduced to 2 at 10 and at 5. My younger brother was about 6 years old at the time. He had a ravenous appetite, and he kept complaining to my father that he didn't have enough to eat. So this was what the family and the national situation was like in China between 1938 and 1941. And yet, in those years, I believe I have had the best elementary education imaginable. One evidence of it is that I can still remember the stories we were told, the stories that help us learn how to read. Let me tell you some of these stories. One had to do with the lesson of diligence, that we children were to study hard. The story is of a village boy who helped his parents on the farm all day. And so he could study only at night. But the family didn't even have enough money to buy a candle. So the boy caught fireflies, put them in a gauze net, and studied by that light. So this was a lesson that we, maybe Chinese children, were taught very young, that you had to study hard, and lack of means is no excuse. You have to use your ingenuity to find ways to study. So that was one lesson. Another lesson is as traditional in China, and that's filial piety. And this story was told to children. I don't think it would be admitted in American society because it's pretty grim. And again, the story starts with a poor family, and the mother was dying, and part of her problem was that she didn't have enough to eat. So the son rolled up his sleeve, used the kitchen knife, and sliced his own flesh and cooked it to feed the mother. I mean, this is a story told us children, 7, 8 years old, and it's a lesson in filial piety, which is, of course, a key virtue in Chinese society. And then there is the story that is natural to this time because China was fighting for its life. So the story was patriotism. And the patriotic story had a historical basis. It actually occurred. And that was in the 13th century. China, or the Song dynasty, was swamped by Mongolian hordes. And so the story, and there's actually a picture in the storybook we were taught to read, showed a Song dynasty general. His name was Yue Fei, and he was kneeling in front of his mother. And the mother had a brush, ink brush, and she wrote on the bare back of her son, the general, 4 characters, 还我河山, which in English would be return to us our rivers and mountains. So these were the 3 Chinese stories that I can still remember. But what made my education, in retrospect, so wonderful was that these Chinese stories were paralleled by Western stories. They were meant to complement the Chinese ones, but in a way, they actually contradicted the Chinese ones. So what are the Western stories? Well, you all have heard of them. One is Newton sitting under an apple tree. So as distinct from working hard by the light of fireflies, you are encouraged to loaf under an apple tree, because that way you learn the laws of gravitation. So another story is of Benjamin Franklin and his kite, his attempt to somehow capture electricity. That story would have been not permissible in China because he endangered his life. And you couldn't possibly do that because a filial son would be careful in order to live so that he could take care of his aged parents. The third Western story I like, and that's perhaps less common, and that is James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine. The story goes that he was an impractical boy, that he was absent-minded. He was always thinking about something, and this worried his mother. So his mother tried to make him more practical and said to him, well, I want you to boil an egg, and what you do is to boil the water and put the egg in it, but only for a short time, say 2 minutes. And here's a watch for you to time it. The mother came back a couple of minutes later to check on his absent-minded boy. She looked into the boiling water and was horrified to find her watch in it. And the boy was looking at the egg that he was holding in his hand. So we Chinese children were taught these proper Chinese values, and then a set of Western ones, which in some ways actually contradict the Chinese ones. But the two together were a wonderful, not only were we taught to read, which is the main purpose, but the story remained with me. But I left out another story. Remember that these were all in Chinese, in simplified Chinese. And that was Oscar Wilde's story called The Happy Prince. I've read recently The Happy Prince, and I found that it's not really a story for young children because it has a very large vocabulary. But I learned the story Happy Prince by reading it in simplified Chinese, and I was strongly influenced by it. Basically, it's a moral tale, but one that was strongly influenced by Christianity and Buddhism. And it's a view of what it means to be good that transcended, being good in the sense of being good to your parents, being good to your neighbors, to your family. It's being good to everyone, being good to total strangers, and at great sacrifice to yourself. So Oscar Wilde's story, The Happy Prince, taught a lesson that remained with me when I became an adult. In adulthood, of course, I learned the usual things at school, history, chemistry. But I never stopped wondering about what it means to be good. But there was a radical shift, and that is when I was young, I wanted to imitate my heroes. I wanted to be good. But when I became older, more sophisticated, I realized that this costed too much, that I really want merely to know what it means to be good, rather than being good. And one of the reasons was that I started to read the Bible because of my interest in Christianity. And I found the Sermon on the Mount that if I practiced the Sermon on the Mount, I wouldn't live very long. Indeed, someone had said, if you claim to be a Christian and you live to a ripe old age, you have some explaining to do. And this is put in different ways. For instance, the great philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said somewhere about the test of a decent civilization. He said a decent civilization is one where you can be good and avoid sudden death. So having realized this, I decided that being good was not for me. Maybe that's why I'm here, 85 years old, and I have some explaining to do. But I just find that, much as I was interested, obviously, in my field, my subject, my discipline of geography, but the things that remain with me as I live longer and longer, geography, the professional discipline, fade further and further from my horizon. And what remains is still this question of what it means to be good. And to me, it's captured in some stories, these vignettes, which I like to tell you, at least a couple of them. One of them happened when I was living in Minneapolis in a high-rise condominium called Towers Condominium, which is very much like the Heights. And every day I would drive from my condo to the university, which is about 2 miles away. But this was winter, and it was snowing heavily. I got into my car, and before I drove very long, the wheels were spinning on ice. I was stuck. And I was just about to get out of the car and walk when, through the snow-spattered window, I saw someone at the opposite side of the street waving, seemingly waving at me. And he was waving at me. He came over and he said, "Let me give you a push." So he pushed my car and freed it from the snow. So I said, "Get in, I'll drive you to where you want to go." And he said that I work at the tower condo as an engineer. So that was very convenient. So I said, okay, I'm not going to venture to go to the campus. I'll return to the condo. And so the two of us were in my car, and slowly we drove back. But as I was driving, I asked him where he lived, and he said that he lived in St. Paul, which was about 5 miles away, and that he too was driving to work to the condo, and he too was stuck in the snow. So he had to abandon his car and walk 5 miles through the snow. And he found many cars similarly stranded. And as he walked these 5 miles, as he trudged through these 5 miles, he freed as many cars as he could. I didn't really look at him when I was driving us back to the condo because I had to be careful. But when I arrived at the condo, I looked at him, and he was a young fellow, beaming with health. And I thanked him, and he smiled at me, revealing a pair of white teeth. And to me, and here is where my imagination ran wild, he was like an archangel come down to save us stranded people. And I was also reminded of something else in the Bible, which is that Jesus was hanging on the cross, and he was taunted. And taunter said that he could save others, but he himself he couldn't save. And it struck me that this is what happened to this young guy. He couldn't push his own car. He had to abandon it. But he could, and he did, help others. Another story, another of these vignettes occurred somewhat earlier, and that was when I was doing field work in Panama. And I had to go to a sandbar about half a mile from the coast itself, and separated from the coast by a mangrove forest. So it was low tide, and I walked from the coast through the mangrove forest to the sandbar where I did my field work. And I was carrying maps and camera and altimeter and all kinds of things, and I was just loaded. But when I finished my work and ready to go back, I was astonished to find that the landscape had totally changed, that the tide had moved in, that there was about 1 foot or 2 feet of water in the swamp. And I thought I would have to wade through this water. And just as I was about to do so, there came a fisherman with a bike that was beat up, old bike, and he had fish that he caught on the handbar. He spoke to me in a language that I couldn't understand, but it was clear that what he wanted me to do, and that was to get on the bike. And then he pushed me through this half a mile of swamp, and I could feel that the effort that he had to push in, because the water in the bottom of the swamp had turned into kind of mud, so he had to push hard. I could almost smell his sweat. But finally, we arrived at the coast. And I got off my bike and said to myself that I would, of course, tip him. So I took out my wallet. And this is something that this is a real confession. I don't look good in it. And that is, I took out my wallet and I started to find a $5 bill. But all I could find were $20 bills. So I searched and searched. Finally, I got the $5 bill. So I turned around to give it to him, and he had disappeared. Now here I was, being so mean. I mean, I was grateful, but I was not ready to express my gratitude with a $20 bill. But this guy never expected a tip. He just pushed me there, and then he left. So it's that kind of goodness that leaves a permanent impression on me. And you would say, well, that's great, but have you learned a lesson? I mean, have you done something similar? And you'll be glad to hear that I did learn a lesson and have done something similar. And that happened fairly recently when I already moved to Capitol Lakes. But I have a sister-in-law in Cincinnati, so I went to her place for Thanksgiving. On my way back, I needed to stop at a rest stop. And when I walked into the men's room, I found two boys there. One looked about 10, and the other, about 4 or 5. And I said to myself, where are the parents? And then I surmised this, that the two boys were driven by their mother, and they stopped there. And I could imagine the mother saying to the younger boy, come with me to the women's restroom. And I can imagine the younger boy said, no way. So finally, the mother said, okay, you go with your brother. And that's where I saw them, the 10-year-old and the 4-year-old. The 10-year-old, the men had these urinals lined up, but there's one for the child, smaller one. The 10-year-old did this job. But the young boy dropped his pants. I don't know whether this is a custom, but very young children don't seem to have underwear. So he dropped his pants, and he was totally naked. And he jumped and jumped at the boys' urinal. He still couldn't reach the proper level. So I said to him, let me help you. And I did. I lifted him up so that he knelt on the edge of the urinal and did his job. And when he was done, I lifted him down, and even before he pulled up his pants, he turned around, smiled at me, and said, thank you. So, you see, this is, in one way, a trivial event. But to me, it's unforgettable. But I said I learned a lesson, and I did, because I did help this little kid. But it was such a pleasure to do it. It was no cost to me. So it was different from the other two stories, where there was some cost to them to help me, to push the bikes through the muck. So this led me to think of the good things that we have done in life. That, speaking for myself, they costed very little. The help I've given to students, the checks I've signed, there was no cost, hardly any. And this makes me think of a story, not from my own experience, but which leaves an impression on me. And it's a story told by Rabbi Israel of Ritzen, who lived in the first part of the 19th century. And the story goes like this. There was a rich man in his carriage, and as he was driving along, he heard a cry. He looked out of the window and found that a villager was stuck, that his wagon was stuck in the mud, that the road turned into mud because of spring rain. So the rich man got off his carriage, and he and his driver then helped the villagers to be freed from the mud. The rich man then tied the wagon to his carriage, and they went to the villagers' home, where the rich man found the villager lived in great poverty, he and his family. So he gave the villager $500. In the course of time, he died and was hauled before the heavenly tribunal. And because of his illegal business dealings, he was assigned to purgatory. At this point, his guardian angel came and said, "Wait a minute, let the heavenly scale be brought in, and we will weigh his good deeds against the bad ones." So the scale was brought in, and the heavenly angel put the villager in the scale, but it still didn't restore the balance. He was still going to purgatory. So the angel said, "Wait a minute, let me put in the wagon and the carriage as well on the scale." It still didn't work. So finally, the angel said, "Let's throw in the mud." And that helped the balance to swing in the guy's favor. So this is the lesson to me, and that is doing good has a real cost. This guy didn't just give the villager $500 or whatever, something that I can imagine myself doing, but he helped the guy to be freed from all that filth, that mud. So throwing in the mud restored the balance. And now finally, I come to the last stage, which is where I am now, 85 years old, going on to 86. And I continue to think about what it means to be good. But I have somehow tied this notion with another one, which is reality. There is a general feeling which I think is correct, and that is a punishment for being not good, for being self-centered, is that you live in a narrow and shadowy world for obvious reasons, because you think of yourself all the time, and that's a small world. But there is another issue about reality that has recently come up with me. And That is, what am I being deprived of if I were to die? And something that I think I can't help thinking about. And my answer to that is reality. And what is reality? Reality is this present moment. This place at this moment is real for us. You know, even if it's a little uncomfortable, you feel a little hot, you find the talk a little too long, but even so, this moment is real. And that when we die, it will be gone. But then I wondered, true, this is the case, but isn't this something that happens all the time? By which I mean, think of just yesterday. You know, yesterday is today. So unreal, so shadowy. Someone making small talk would say to me, hey, what did you do yesterday? And I have to think hard what I did. And what I did wasn't all that exciting. But it doesn't mean that it's exciting for you now, because as I said, the talk could be rather boring. But that's not the point. Whether it's exciting or not, this moment is very real, isn't it? But tomorrow, today will be yesterday, and what happens here would be very shadowy. So what I'm saying to myself is that this reality is of the moment, that we should be used to the shadowy life that is made up of all yesterdays up to this point. Well, I don't know about you, but I can't help wondering, what will happen if I die? And my most common answer is that I would enter into oblivion. And in a way, I actually welcome it, because I sleep very poorly. I toss back and forth, and I have this restless leg syndrome, which tortures me. And I've often thought how wonderful it would be to enter total oblivion. But there is also this other notion which religious people embrace, and that is that when we depart from this life, we enter into another one that is richer, more beautiful, more real than the one we live here. The trouble is that our imagination isn't strong enough to cope with the image of this afterlife, call it paradise or heaven. I mean, the traditional one shows us dressed in white gowns, singing in a chorus. I mean, it's very good to do it for half an hour or an hour, but eternity, this doesn't sound like what I would like to do. I mean, there are whole books depicting what heaven is like, and none of it seems as real as what is happening this moment. Not even the greatest writer could evoke a believable image of heaven. And I suppose the outstanding example is Dante, his Divine Comedy. So many people have said that his depiction of hell was so real, it's horrible. but his depiction of heaven, by comparison, was rather pallid. It didn't have that vividness that we hope for. So we lacked the imagination to envisage this place that is better, more real than the one now. And then I think, and this is what I would leave you with, and that is, maybe there are ways of thinking about a reality in the afterlife that is more vivid, more real than what we know here. The example that is not very inspiring is this, but nonetheless it's a good one. And that is, think of it. Think of the time when you have had a bad cold, and for days, maybe even weeks, you lived in a world that seems to be full of cotton. I mean, nothing has an edge to it. It's so kind of woolly and unreal. We've all had this experience. And then one day, rather suddenly, the cold disappears. And how wonderful the world seems when that happens. So maybe this would be a commonplace example. But I would end with a more dignified one, which goes like this, and which actually happened. And that is during the Second World War. The British had their warships moving stealthily up and down the Norwegian coast. Why? Because Norway at that time was strongly under the influence of the Nazis. And Britain was separated from Norway by just the North Sea. So the British warship would do this to get as much information as I could for what was happening in Norway. But they always moved in the dark or in a thick fog so as not to be detected. And you'd say this was very risky because the Norwegian coast is highly indented and it had islands. It's very dangerous to move there. So how did the British warships manage when they sailed in the dark or in a thick fog? Well, the answer was the British had invented the radar. So what happened was that the sailors would descend into the hull of the ship, and the navigator would sail the ship by means of radar, which I understand looks like just a dish, illuminated dish, with a needle that swings around, occasionally with flashes, and these flashes were the rocks that you needed to avoid. So what happened was that for days, the navigator, fellow officers, and much of the crew would descend into the hull, crowded, dark hull of the ship, and navigate by means of this radar disk. After a few days, they began to think that this was all there was to reality. Reality was this radar disk that enabled them to sail up and down the coast without hitting it. So that's a test of reality. In a dream world, you would get into trouble. But this was the real world, and the real world of the radar prevented you from running into the coast. So for days they looked at the radar screen and came to feel that this was the real world. One day, the captain said, "What the heck? Let's all go on deck and get some fresh air." And when I got up, there was the real world. There was the blue sky and fluffy clouds. There was the air, the sound of seagulls, the air tainted with this fragrance of seaweed, and this incredible dented fjord coast of Norway with waterfalls coming down like a bride's veil. So that's reality, not the disk, the radar disk. So this is what I'm saying. What seems to us so real maybe is just us navigating through life by looking at this disk. What is real when we die or when we climb on deck was this world of extraordinary beauty. Okay, thank you. If you have questions, I would try to answer.
I don't think you want to ask a question, but I certainly would like to tell you how much thought and work that you gave into this and how much you gave. It's wonderfully, wonderfully interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I look forward to seeing you. We're all here.